first time people saw him up close, they didn't notice his age or his collar. They noticed the smell. A sick man sat on the ground with his legs stretched out, skin split, swollen, wet, angry red. Flies landed like they owned the place. Someone nearby gagged and turned away. Someone else whispered, "Don't touch him. Whatever he has, it clings." In that moment, the crowd didn't look at the patient with pity. They looked at him with fear and a little disgust. And then a quiet priest stepped forward, knelt down, and did the one thing nobody expected. He didn't preach. He didn't perform a miracle like a thunderclap. He simply took the man's foot in his hands, steady hands, and began to clean it, calmly, like it was the most normal thing in the world. The flies returned. The stink fought back. The onlookers flinched again, but the priest didn't. His face didn't twist. His voice didn't rise. He just kept working, like he'd already decided that if God was anywhere, he was here too. That priest was Cyprian Tansi, Cyprian Tansi, the man Nigeria would one day call its first blessed. And the story you think you know, a holy man lived, prayed, died, is not the story that kept people awake at night. Because before he ever touched a wound like that, something else tried to claim him first. Something older than churches, older than his own name. And it almost won. He was not born into saintliness. He was born into a world that did not need saints, only survivors. September, 1903. Aguleri. The land was green and generous, but life could be ruthless. The river could feed you, the forest could hide you, and the night could swallow you if you didn't know which spirits were listening. In the village, people didn't ask, "What do you believe?" They asked, "What protects you?" He arrived as Iwane, a child named by parents who were not Christians. His family carried the weight of tradition like an inheritance you couldn't refuse. Stories weren't entertainment. They were instructions. You learned early what not to say out loud. You learned which paths were safe after dark. You learned that misfortune wasn't random. It had a face, a motive, a name. And then, one day, the missionaries came closer, not as a rumor, not as a distant curiosity. They built schools. They brought books. They taught letters that could trap sound on paper like magic. The adults watched carefully. Some felt threatened. Some felt tempted. Because a school is never just a school. It is a doorway. And when a doorway opens, two things happen. Light enters, and shadows move. Iwane's parents made a decision that would later look like destiny and, in the moment, looked like a practical gamble. They sent the boy to a place touched by the new faith, not because they were ready to convert, but because they were ready to compete. The world was changing. A child with education could become a shield for the family, a bridge, a bargaining chip. Survival again. So the boy went, small, sharp-eyed, quiet, in a way that made people underestimate him. He lived with a Christian uncle for a time, close enough to hear prayers as part of the furniture of daily life. He watched people kneel with their whole bodies, not just their lips. He watched names change. New names like uniforms, like new skins. At first, Iwane did what any intelligent child does when dropped into a new world. He studied it, the gestures, the songs, the strange idea that God could be one, not a crowd. The stranger idea that this God cared about the poor more than the powerful. It should have felt like an insult to the old order. Instead, it felt like an invitation, and still, the rival was there. Always there. Because in Aguleri, in those years, the enemy wasn't a single man with a villain's grin. The enemy was a system of fear that fed on uncertainty. It lived in the whispered warnings. It lived in the way people looked over their shoulders before speaking. It lived in the ritual specialist, the man people visited when sickness came, when a child wouldn't stop crying, when a harvest failed. The man who could charge a price for relief, or for the promise of relief. The man who, even when he meant well, held power like a knife. The boy began to notice something. When people were afraid, they became easy to control. And when he read about saints, men and women who stepped into fear and didn't blink, Something in him reacted like a match catching flame. Then came the first twist of his life. He lost an eye. It happened fast, the way childhood disasters always do. A game, a careless moment, a sharp object, a shout, and suddenly his world tilted. Pain. Panic. Hands grabbing his face. Adults swearing. Someone crying that it was a curse, or punishment, or the jealous work of unseen forces. Later, when the bleeding stopped and the shock settled into a new normal, one truth remained. The boy who was supposed to see far now saw less. The village could have interpreted it as a warning. Stay in your place. Don't reach for the strange faith. Don't provoke what you don't understand. But Iwen did something that would become his signature. He took what should have broken him and turned it into a vow. If half his sight was gone, then the other half would be used with purpose. He threw himself into learning like a man trying to outrun fate. He became the kind of student teachers remember years later, not because he was loud, but because he was relentless. He learned scripture like it was a map. He learned discipline like it was a weapon. He learned prayer the way a farmer learns weather, by watching, by waiting, by refusing to be fooled. And somewhere in those years, the idea of baptism stopped being a foreign ritual and became a line he wanted to cross. When he was around 9 or 10, he was baptized, taking the name Michael, a new name, a new allegiance. Michael, like the archangel, the fighter, the one who doesn't negotiate with darkness. To some people, it was just water and words. To his world, it was an act of defiance. Because he wasn't just joining a religion, he was switching sides in a battle his community had been fighting for generations. The battle over who gets to define fear. And fear does not surrender politely. There were murmurs. Family members who thought he was being pulled away. Neighbors who joked, not kindly, that the boy was becoming too foreign. Men who said the missionaries were clever. They didn't steal your land first. They stole your children's minds. Michael heard it all. He didn't argue the way teenagers argue. He didn't swagger. He didn't perform rebellion. He simply kept going. Straight. Like a spear. By his late teens and early 20s, he wasn't just a student. He was useful. The church noticed. The village noticed too, and not everyone was happy about it. He worked as a catechist, a teacher, even a headmaster. Roles that sound gentle until you understand what they meant in a place where the future was being rewritten. To teach children to read wasn't neutral. To teach them doctrine wasn't harmless. Every lesson was a quiet earthquake. And now the rivalry became personal. Because the old guardians of spiritual authority, the men who knew which sacrifices pleased which spirits, the men who could interpret nightmares, the men who held the community's secret dread in their hands, began to watch Michael like a problem that needed solving. Some tried to seduce him back into the old safety. You're smart. You're respected. Why pick a fight with what our fathers feared? Some tried ridicule. So now you think you're holier than your own people? Some tried something sharper. Be careful, Michael. A tree that grows too tall gets cut by the wind. And Michael didn't bend. Not because he was fearless by nature, not because he never felt the cold pressure of the supernatural stories he'd grown up with, but because he had found a different kind of fear, one that outmatched the rest. He was afraid of wasting his life. That fear is the engine of saints. Still, the conflict tightened when his family realized this wasn't a phase. Teaching could be tolerated. Being church-involved could be tolerated. But Michael's hunger was moving toward something that would permanently remove him from the old expectations. The priesthood. And that was not just a career choice. It was a social rupture. A priest would belong to the church first, family second. A priest would challenge customs, not from outside with mockery, but from inside with authority. A priest could tell people no and have God behind him. A priest could dismantle the little economies of fear that certain people depended on. So resistance rose, not always loudly, but consistently, like a thorn in the shoe. Michael's own home became a battlefield of persuasion. The arguments were practical on the surface. Who will carry on the family line? Who will be there when the elders need you? Who will protect us if you offend the ancestors? Underneath, it was simpler. Don't leave us. Because when one person walks toward holiness, everyone else feels exposed, like their compromises are suddenly visible. Michael didn't answer with speeches. He answered with decisions. In 1925, at about 22, he entered St. Paul's Seminary in Igbarium, a step that turned murmurs into reality. The boy had crossed too many lines now to pretend he could return unchanged. The seminary was not romantic. It was not soft candlelight and angelic music. It was hard routine, hard study, hard obedience. It tested the body and the ego. It shaved down arrogance, sometimes brutally. And Michael had a particular kind of arrogance that was dangerous. Not pride in appearance, but pride in self-control. The feeling that if he could just be disciplined enough, pure enough, strict enough, then he could force goodness into the world. That belief would make him powerful. And later, it would wound him. Inside the seminary, the rivalry took on a new mask. Because an enemy doesn't always arrive carrying a spear. Sometimes it arrives in a familiar face, in someone who looks like you, talks like you, even prays like you, but wants something different. There was always at least one voice in any training house, the voice of compromise. The voice that says, yes, yes, God is good, but don't be extreme. Don't be inconvenient. Don't be so pure you become alone. Maybe it was a fellow student who treated the whole thing like a ladder to status. Maybe it was a superior who believed strictness mattered more than mercy. Maybe it was the little whisper inside Michael himself. If you fail, everyone will say the old way was right. If you fail, you'll prove them correct. That whisper became his competitor, his constant rival for the steering wheel of his soul. And Michael responded the only way he knew. More discipline, more effort, more fasting, more prayer, more control. From the outside, it looked impressive. From the inside, it was war. Because the seminary doesn't just teach theology, it teaches you what you're made of when nobody applauds. Days of study blurred into nights of silence. He learned to wake before dawn. He learned to kneel when his knees begged him to stop. He learned Latin responses that felt like a secret code, connecting him to a church far older than his village. And yet he also learned something else, something more dangerous. He was becoming different, not better, different. And that difference would one day put him in direct collision with the very people he wanted to save. But before that, there was another twist waiting in the dark. The boy who came from non-Christian parents, who lost an eye, who became a teacher, who fought fear with prayer, was about to become the kind of priest Nigeria had barely seen. Not a visitor, not a foreign missionary, a son of the soil, standing at the altar. And when that happens, it changes everything. Because then the question becomes unavoidable. If one of us can live like this, what excuse do the rest of us have? The seminary didn't care that Michael had come from a village where spirits had names and fear had rules. It cared about one thing. Whether he could be remade. The first shock wasn't theology. It was the silence. Silence in the morning when the air still tastes like night. Silence when you're tired enough to hallucinate the sound of your own heartbeat. Silence that doesn't comfort you. Silence that interrogates you. In Aguilera, silence could mean danger. In the seminary, silence meant something worse. It meant you couldn't run from yourself. Michael discovered very quickly that you can hide from a village, but you can't hide from the God you claim to serve. Not when you're locked inside routine, bells, prayers, lectures, discipline, day after day. The spiritual life isn't mostly visions. It's mostly repetition, and repetition is where pretenders die. This is where his real rival stepped out of the shadows. Not a man with a machete, not an angry elder. A voice. The voice that says, if you become holy enough, you'll finally be safe. And beneath that, if you become holy enough, you'll finally be admired. Michael hated that voice the moment he recognized it, because it sounded so much like virtue, dressed up in religious clothing, pretending it was devotion, when it was actually hunger. And hunger, in a seminary, is dangerous. It makes you compete in secret. Who prays longer? Who fasts harder? Who looks the most serious? Who gets praised by the superiors? Who gets noticed? In every formation house, there's always at least one person who turns holiness into a scoreboard. Some do it openly. Most do it quietly. Michael had a particular risk. He didn't need applause from people. He wanted the feeling of being untouchable. Like if he could just tighten his discipline enough, life would never surprise him again. But life surprises saints on purpose. Years passed with the kind of slow pressure that changes stone. Philosophy, theology, scripture, sacraments, moral teaching, canonical rules, sermons practiced in front of classmates who listened with polite faces and sharp eyes, confessions rehearsed in theory before he would ever hear one in reality. Michael learned to speak of grace, while wrestling with the fear that his own soul might not be as clean as he wanted it to be. And then something else began to haunt him. The thought of going back home as a priest. Because going home as a priest would mean standing in front of people who had known him as a boy, some who had mocked him, some who had warned him, some who had loved him but wanted him to stay predictable, and he would have to say, with his whole body, without arrogance and without apology, "I belong to God." That sentence sounds simple until you realize how many invisible hands will try to pull you away from it. There were letters, messages, visiting relatives, some friendly, some pressuring. In their words, you could hear the same old anxiety dressed in new arguments. Be careful not to offend the ancestors. Don't shame your family. Don't become too strict. People won't follow you. If you become a priest, at least be a comfortable one. Life is hard enough. Comfortable. That was the word that made something cold form in his stomach, because Michael had already seen what comfortable religion looked like. It looked like a holy man who can be bribed, a preacher who blesses what the rich want. Blessed, a leader who avoids conflict, even when conflict is the only door to freedom. Michael didn't want to become a priest who would one day be purchased. But here's the twist. The same intensity that protected him from corruption could also turn him into a weapon, not a healer. A weapon. And God wasn't calling him to be a weapon. He was calling him to be a father. So the seminary kept sanding him down, sometimes gently, sometimes painfully. And the more he prayed, the more he realized something terrifying. He couldn't control God. In the village, people tried to control the unseen world through ritual. Do this, sacrifice that, obey this rule, avoid that taboo, and you will be safe. But the Christian God wasn't like that. He was not a force to manipulate. He was a person to obey. Obedience. That was the word that began to chase Michael. And obedience is humiliating, because obedience means you don't get to be the author of your own holiness. You become the page, and God writes, "Then came December 1937. The air in Onitsha carried the heavy electricity of significance, even if you didn't have the words for it. Inside the Cathedral Basilica of the Most Holy Trinity, something rare was happening for that time and place. An indigenous Nigerian was about to be ordained a Catholic priest in a church where, for a long time, most priests had been foreign missionaries. Wikipedia +2, Mount St. Bernard, org +2. Michael stood there in vestments that felt too large for the boy he had once been. He could feel eyes on him, some proud, some doubtful, some simply stunned. And it hit him. His ordination wasn't only about him. It was about every young man who had been told, directly or indirectly, God chooses others, not you. It was about every family that assumed holiness was a foreign import. It was about every elder who believed the old fear would always win because it had always won. On 19th of December 1937, he was ordained a priest for the Archdiocese of Onitsha. Wikipedia. +1. People clapped. People sang. People cried. And somewhere, quietly, someone resented him. Because an authentic priest does something dangerous. He makes excuses harder to believe. Now, he belonged to the altar. He belonged to the confessional. He belonged to the sickbed. He belonged to the dead. He belonged to weddings where families fought, and to funerals where grief turned into rage. He belonged to the parts of life where people stopped pretending. And the moment he became father, the rivalry sharpened into a new form. Not tradition versus church anymore. Now it was something subtler. What kind of priest would he be? Because by then, a new temptation had entered the church in Nigeria, one that looked harmless at first. The idea that the priesthood could be a ladder out of poverty, that it could be a respectable escape, a clean shirt, a roof that doesn't leak, food that arrives without begging. Wikipedia. Michael saw the risk immediately. If the priest becomes above the people, he will eventually stop serving them. If he lives like a small king, he will eventually demand small worship. So he did something that shocked even Catholics who loved him. He chose austerity, on purpose, not as a performance, as a strategy. He lived simply, traveled simply, ate simply, slept simply. People later remembered him as a priest who seemed almost allergic to comfort, not because he hated joy, but because he feared the slow rot of entitlement. Wikipedia. And that choice created enemies. Quiet ones. Because when one person refuses comfort, everyone who accepts comfort starts to feel accused, even if no accusation is spoken. He was assigned to parish work, beginning as a curate, and quickly thrown into the messy bloodstream of real communities. DayCB.org. And here, the coming to God became visceral. It's one thing to adore God in a chapel. It's another thing to adore God while someone screams at you because you won't approve their arrangement. It's another thing to adore God when a woman arrives trembling, whispering that she's cursed, and she's ready to do anything, pay anything, to make the fear stop. Michael learned that people rarely come to priests because they want ideas. They come because they are desperate, because something is breaking, because they are afraid. And fear is where the old rival still lived. That ancient system of dread didn't disappear just because a cathedral existed. It adapted. It learned Christian vocabulary. It put on a rosary like a disguise. It kept whispering the same message. God is far, but your fear is close. Michael's mission, whether he realized it or not, was to make God feel closer than fear. So he started doing the kind of priestly work that doesn't make heroic posters, but changes lives like surgery. He listened. For hours. He heard confessions until voices went hoarse. He reconciled families that had split like broken pottery. He instructed couples for marriage, slowly, carefully, because he understood that the biggest battlefield in his culture wasn't politics. It was the home. And the enemy knew it too. That's why, the more he tried to reform lives, the more resistance grew. Not always violent, but relentless. Some men accused him of disrespecting tradition. Some accused him of breaking families when he challenged practices that harmed women. Some said he was too hard, too demanding, too uncompromising. And Michael had to face an ugly question. Was he truly serving God? Or was he feeding his own hunger for strictness? That question is where many good priests become dangerous. They start fighting sin as if sinners are the enemy. They start winning arguments and losing souls. Michael did not want to become that. So he began to develop a different kind of strength. The strength that looks like softness, but isn't. He learned patience. He learned to let people walk slowly. He learned to hold firm lines without hatred. He learned to preach like a man who expects God to act, not like a man who is trying to control outcomes. But the rival didn't stop. It changed again, this time into a competitor that looked holy, the temptation to become a legend while still alive. Because people started talking, not in official announcements, in the marketplace, at the river, in the roads between villages. They said, "That priest doesn't take bribes." They said, "That priest walks in rain like it's nothing." Wikipedia. They said, "That priest will tell you the truth even if you hate him." They said, "When you confess to him, you feel like you've been washed from the inside." And when people say things like that, a man's soul becomes a battlefield. Because praise can be more poisonous than insults. Michael felt it. He felt the pull of it. And then, another twist. Instead of leaning into fame, he began to long for something that made no sense to most people around him. He began to long for hiddenness, not retirement, not comfort. Hiddenness, the kind of life where your name isn't on anyone's lips, where your success isn't measured in crowds, where the only applause you get is the sound of your own breathing in a chapel at night. At first, he tried to crush the desire. It seemed selfish. He had work to do. People needed him. Nigeria needed priests. But the longing didn't leave. It deepened. And he realized, slowly, reluctantly, that God was calling him not only to serve outwardly, but to be consumed inwardly. That call has a name: monastic desire, the hunger for God alone. He didn't tell everyone. He didn't dramatize it. He carried it like a coal in his chest, because he knew what people would say. So you're leaving us? So you want an easier life? So now you're too holy for your own people? And he also knew something else. If he pursued that call, it would mean stepping into a new battlefield, one where the enemy wouldn't be tradition or fear. The enemy would be the most brutal opponent of all: loneliness. But for now, he stayed, and the tension kept rising, because the priest who dreamed of hiddenness was about to be placed in situations that demanded the opposite: public confrontation, moral reform, and a kind of courage that would make the old myths tremble. And it would happen in a place where people's fear had a geography, a place that had a reputation like a curse, a forest no one wanted to name after sunset. The forest had a reputation the way some people have reputations, half true, half exaggerated, and fully powerful. In certain villages, you didn't say its name at night. You didn't point at it. You didn't joke about it. Because if you laughed at fear, fear might decide to laugh back. And now, Father Cyprian, because that was the name he wore publicly now, the name he had chosen like armor, was expected to walk straight through places like that, carrying nothing but a small bag, a rosary, and a stubborn peace that made people uneasy. His ministry was not the kind you could summarize with one heroic act. It was the kind built from thousands of small, exhausting decisions that most people avoid: refusing bribes, correcting lies, visiting the sick when the sick were contagious, standing between families and their own worst impulses. But if you want the moment his life became a pressure cooker, where the conflict stopped being theoretical and turned into a fight, you have to understand what he was really up against. It wasn't paganism versus Christianity, not in the cartoonish way outsiders imagine. It was an economy of fear. Fear had its own professionals, its own consultants, its own prices, its own rituals, and like any economy, it had winners who did not want the market disrupted. In some places, when a child fell ill, a mother did not first ask, "What medicine?" She asked, "Who did we offend?" When a harvest failed, people didn't ask, "What happened to the soil?" They asked, "Who is jealous of us?" When a man's business went bad, he didn't ask, "What did I do wrong?" He asked, "Which enemy is doing this to me?" And as long as those questions ruled the mind, certain people held power. Cyprian's preaching threatened that power, not because he insulted his people, but because he offered a terrifying alternative. What if you are not cursed? What if you are not hunted? What if the world is not a room full of traps? What if God is closer than all of that? That kind of message sounds comforting, until you realize it also demands responsibility. Because if fear isn't in charge, then you can't blame fear for everything. You have to change. And people will forgive almost anything except the demand to change. So the rivalry tightened around him like wire. The first antagonist came wearing a respectable face, a man with influence. Let's call him Obioha, because he could have been any Obioha in any town. A community figure who enjoyed the complicated web of favors and obligations. He was not a cartoon villain. He donated when it made him look generous. He smiled in public. He greeted the priest warmly, but he had a private system. Gifts for certain decisions, pressure for certain outcomes, and a soft expectation that the church would bless whatever arrangement. The powerful wanted blessed. Cyprian met that system the way a rock meets a wave, not with rage, with refusal. Obioha offered support for parish needs, money for repairs, food for the rectory, gifts that were just generous enough to make rejecting them look rude. Cyprian thanked him, then redirected it to the poor without any theatrical speech. It was an insult disguised as holiness. Obioha tried a different approach. Social pressure. "Father, don't embarrass me. People are watching. We are on the same side." Cyprian's answer was quiet and devastating. "If we are on the same side, then we can both stand in the light." The next approach was sharper, an attempt to recruit another priest, someone less strict, someone who liked comfort, someone who resented Cyprian's growing reputation. That's how rivalries often work. You don't attack the person directly, you attack the trust around them. Suddenly rumors arrived like mosquitoes. "Father Cyprian thinks he's better than everyone. Father Cyprian is too harsh, he breaks homes. Father Cyprian humiliates people in confession. Father Cyprian wants to control the community." A rumor is a perfect weapon because it doesn't have to be proven. It only has to be repeated. Cyprian felt it. He felt the subtle shift in the way people greeted him, smiles with a little less warmth, eyes that studied him for hidden motives. He also felt something else, a temptation to defend himself, to argue, to win. And this is where his story turns unexpectedly human, because he almost took the bait. There were nights he couldn't sleep, replaying conversations, imagining speeches he could give. He could have crushed his critics with logic. He could have shamed them with moral clarity. He could have won. But that would have turned him into a different kind of priest, a priest who defeats people instead of saving them. So he did something that looks passive until you realize how hard it is. He stayed consistent. He kept visiting the sick. He kept teaching children. He kept instructing couples for marriage. He kept demanding honesty in a culture where everyone was used to bending truth to survive. And slowly, the community began to notice the difference between a rumor and a reality. Reality is stubborn. Reality is the woman whose husband stopped beating her because the priest didn't just condemn him. He challenged him, confronted him, and then refused to give up on him. Reality is the young man who planned revenge and ended up in the confessional, shaking, because Father Cyprian looked at him like he was still redeemable. Reality is the widow who expected to be discarded and instead received food, companionship, and dignity. Cyprian didn't build his influence with speeches. He built it with a pattern of choices that cost him something. And the more it cost him, the more he became dangerous to the wrong people. The rivalry escalated when he began focusing on something he considered a spiritual emergency: marriage and family life. In many communities, marriage wasn't only about two people. It was about clans, inheritance, obligations, status. It could also be a minefield of practices that left women exposed and children unstable. Some men treated marriage like ownership. Some families treated it like a transaction. Cyprian didn't have the luxury of preaching vague spirituality. He preached directly into people's most sensitive habits: money, sex, power, pride. He demanded proper preparation for marriage. He insisted on fidelity. He pushed against the idea that a man's appetite excused cruelty. He confronted the habit of using spiritual fears as justification for controlling wives, punishing children, or eliminating rivals. For some people, this felt like a priest meddling. For Cyprian, it felt like pulling poison out of a wound, and poison fights back. Obioha and others like him shifted from rumor to resistance. They tried to make parish life impossible. They withheld cooperation. They pressured families. "If you follow him, don't expect help from us." They made the church feel like a foreign force again, something suspicious, something disruptive. Cyprian's response was almost annoying in its calmness. He didn't retaliate. He made the parish more alive. He strengthened the catechists. He trained lay leaders. He organized instruction so people understood what they believed, not just what they repeated. He turned the church from a building into a community. And then came a twist that even his enemies didn't anticipate. He started lifting up women, not as a political stunt, as a spiritual strategy. He had seen how faith survives in homes, how mothers and grandmothers keep prayer alive when men drift, when the world gets harsh, when fear tries to reclaim the household. He understood that if you want a community to change, you don't begin with the loudest voices. You begin with the most faithful ones. So he encouraged women's groups. He formed them carefully, with discipline and purpose. He gave them a role that was not decorative. He insisted on their dignity in a way that forced men to adjust their mental habits. This was not universally celebrated. Some men felt threatened. Some thought it was improper. Some insisted he was weak because he cared about what women suffered. Others, more cynical, feared that educated, spiritually confident women would no longer be easily controlled by superstition or intimidation. Obioha, watching all this, made a calculation. If he couldn't bend Cyprian, he would isolate him. So the next move was psychological warfare. A delegation came, polite, smiling, requesting a private meeting. They didn't call him a liar. They didn't accuse him loudly. They just asked questions that were shaped like traps. Father, are you sure you aren't pushing too fast? Father, do you think you understand our culture better than we do? Father, people say you're making enemies. Is that wise? Father, are you trying to be a saint? That last one landed like a slap, because Cyprian knew the ugliness hidden inside that sentence. It wasn't admiration. It was mockery. It was a way of saying, stop making us look bad. For a moment, he felt heat rise in him. Anger. Yes, but also something more embarrassing. The desire to prove them wrong by proving them right, by becoming exactly what they mocked. He looked at them and said simply, I'm trying to belong to God. And that was the end of the meeting. Not because they agreed, but because there was no handle to grab. People who live by manipulation hate a person who refuses to be manipulated. After that, the attacks grew less polite. Suddenly, a story circulated that a sick child had died because the priest refused the proper spiritual remedy. Suddenly, someone claimed that a family's misfortune began the day they joined the church. Suddenly, old tales of curses and jealous enemies became louder. The atmosphere thickened. Some parishioners grew afraid. The old rival, the fear economy, was trying to reclaim territory. Cyprian understood the tactic. Make the cost of following God feel too high. So he countered it the only way that works. He went to the people most terrified, and he stayed with them. He visited homes at night. He prayed over the anxious. He taught with patience. He challenged the storytellers of doom by giving people a sturdier story, one where God was stronger than invisible threats. But there's a price for that kind of spiritual work. It drains you. It empties your emotional reserves. And Cyprian, who already had a tendency toward intensity, began to live on the edge of exhaustion. He would hear confessions until late, then rise before dawn for prayer. He would walk long distances to preach, then return and counsel couples whose arguments had sharpened into hatred. He carried people's guilt like sacks of stones and still tried to smile. Then came another twist. His enemies, unable to break him publicly, began to attack him privately, through the people he loved. There were whispers to his relatives. Your son has become arrogant. There were warnings to his friends. He will ruin your standing. There were subtle threats. If you keep supporting him, don't expect favors. Cyprian felt the temptation to retreat, to become less demanding, to soften his edges, not out of mercy, but out of fear. And this is where his holiness shows its teeth. He didn't retreat. He refined. He realized that strictness without tenderness becomes cruelty. Tenderness without strictness becomes weakness. The priesthood demanded both. So he developed a pastoral style that unsettled people. He could be unyielding about truth and unbelievably gentle about repentance. That combination is rare. It disarms the proud and rescues the ashamed. People started changing. Not dramatically, not all at once, but in a way you could see if you watched long enough. A man who used to boast about violence became quieter. A woman who used to live in terror of spiritual enemies began to sleep again. Families that had lived in constant suspicion started eating together like they actually liked each other. And when a community begins to heal, the professionals of fear lose customers. That's when the rivalry reached the edge of danger. One evening, a messenger arrived with urgent news. Someone was seriously ill, and the family insisted the priest come immediately. The road was dark. The path cut near places people avoided. Several parishioners begged him not to go alone. Cyprian went anyway, because he had learned the fundamental rule of spiritual fatherhood. When someone is dying, you don't negotiate. He arrived to find not one sick person, but a room full of tense faces. Too many men, too much silence, too much watching. It was a setup, not necessarily for violence, but for humiliation, a demand, a trap. They wanted to force him to perform in a way that would compromise him, to endorse a practice he could not endorse, to bless a decision he could not bless, to accept a gift he could not accept. Obioha was there, seated like a judge, smiling. "Father," he said softly, "we only need your cooperation. One word from you, and peace returns." Cyprian looked at the faces around him, some angry, some curious, some frightened. He saw young boys at the doorway, learning what power looks like. He saw women in the back, eyes lowered, waiting to see whether the priest would protect them or abandon them. And in that moment, Cyprian understood something with crystal clarity. This wasn't about him anymore. It was about whether the church would be purchased. He spoke calmly. He refused. Not loudly, not dramatically. Just refused. The air tightened. Obioha leaned forward. "Do you know what you're doing?" Cyprian answered, "Yes." And then, another twist. The sick person they had used as bait suddenly coughed, violently. The room turned, momentarily, toward the actual human suffering they'd been using as leverage. Cyprian moved immediately to the bedside. No lecture, no scolding, just care. He prayed. He comforted. He asked for water. He worked like a man who had forgotten his own safety, and that simple, practical compassion broke the performance. People who came to watch a priest be shamed ended up watching a priest be a father. The setup collapsed, not in fireworks, but in embarrassment. The men lost their appetite for the confrontation because the tone had changed. It's hard to play power games when a man is dying in front of you. Cyprian left that night, walking back through the dark, alone, with a strange calm in his chest. He had won, yet he didn't feel victorious. He felt tired. Not tired like, "I need sleep." Tired like, "I have poured myself out." And now the most unsettling thought returned, stronger than ever. Hiddenness. He began to recognize the shape of his calling more clearly. He was not running away from Nigeria. He was being pulled into a different engine room of the church, one that would feed everything else. He began to seek deeper discipline, deeper prayer, deeper interior silence. And in those years, something astonishing happened. Something that would later become one of the reasons people spoke of him with reverence. He helped cultivate a local religious life, encouraging a new community of women consecrated to God, rooted in Nigerian soil, shaped by Eucharistic devotion and practical service. Not as a political symbol, but as a spiritual force. Women trained to pray, to serve, to live with seriousness and joy. It was a quiet revolution. Holiness no longer imported, but grown. Holiness with familiar accents, familiar faces. Holiness that could walk barefoot through red dust and still feel at home in the presence of God. And as that new life grew, the old fear economy took another hit. Because when a young woman chooses God freely, fear loses leverage. When she learns discipline, fear loses its voice. When she learns prayer, fear loses its mythology. Cyprian watched it and felt two opposite emotions collide inside him. Satisfaction, because the work was bearing fruit, and a deeper longing, because the fruit was costing him his health. His body began to complain. It wasn't dramatic at first, just the small betrayals. Fatigue that didn't lift, aches that lingered, a sense that his strength was being spent faster than it could be replenished. His friends urged him to rest. His admirers begged him to slow down. His critics strangely began to quiet, because even enemies can sense when a man is burning himself alive for something. Cyprian didn't want to die. He wanted to be used properly. So he did something that surprised almost everyone around him. He began to consider leaving active parish life, not because he was quitting, but because he was listening. He felt called to a stricter, more contemplative life, one where prayer itself becomes a kind of labor and silence becomes a form of preaching. And the rivalry shifted one last time into the most personal form of all, because now his opponent wasn't Obioha or rumor or fear merchants. It was the voice that said, "If you leave, people will think you abandoned them. If you leave, your enemies will celebrate. If you leave, you will lose your influence. If you stay, you can keep being needed." That word can trap good people for life. Cyprian stared at it like a serpent. He had spent years refusing money, refusing manipulation, refusing fear. Now he had to refuse something even more intoxicating, the identity of being indispensable. And once that decision began to harden inside him, the trajectory of his life bent sharply toward a place nobody in his village would have predicted. A place far from the red earth, far from the familiar languages, far from the crowds. A place where his holiness would be tested without applause. A place where, ironically, he would become more Nigerian than ever, because everything he had would be stripped down to its core. Prayer, obedience, love. The decision to leave wasn't dramatic. No grand farewell, no speech designed to make people weep. That's what made it terrifying. Because when Father Cyprian Tansi finally admitted to himself that God was pulling him toward a hidden life, he understood exactly what his critics would say. He's escaping. He's tired of his own people. He wants a foreign holiness, cleaner, easier, quieter. They were wrong. But wrong accusations still sting, because they carry a grain of truth you have to wrestle to the ground. Yes, he was tired. Tired in the bones. Yes, he wanted quiet, because his soul had been living in constant emergency mode. And yes, he wanted to be far from the noise, not because Nigeria was too much, but because he knew something most people never learn. If the engine room of prayer goes silent, the whole ship eventually drifts. So he didn't run away from his people. He went deeper, so he could carry them in a different way. In 1950, he left for a Trappist monastery, far from the humidity of the Niger, far from the chatter of markets, far from the familiar rhythm of village life. He traveled into a colder world, both in temperature and in mood, where the sky looked like it had forgotten how to smile. The first time he stepped into that monastic landscape, it hit him like a physical slap. Gray stone, bare trees like skeletal hands, fog that swallowed distance, silence so thick it felt like cloth pressed against the mouth. This was not the romantic, quiet people imagine. This was silence with teeth. And the irony was immediate. He had come to hide, but now he stood out more than ever. A Nigerian priest in a European monastery in mid-century England wasn't just a new monk. He was a visual disruption, a living reminder that the church was bigger than anyone's comfort zone. Some brothers welcomed him sincerely. Others were polite in a way that felt like a closed door. A few, rare but real, carried the kind of prejudice that doesn't shout. It simply withholds warmth. Cyprian didn't fight them. He fought something harder. He fought the instinct to defend himself. Because his old rival, the one that had followed him from seminary days, returned wearing a new costume. Prove yourself. In the parish, he had proven himself through service. In Nigeria, he had proven himself through integrity. Now he was in a monastery where nobody cared about his reputation. Nobody needed his charisma. Nobody wanted his usefulness. The work was internal, hidden, repetitive, and that can crush a person who secretly feeds on being needed. Here, if you wanted to be great, you had to become small, so small that your ego couldn't fit through the door. So he began again, like a beginner. Early rising, work in silence, prayer at fixed hours, meals without conversation. Long stretches where your mind becomes a battlefield because there are no distractions left to hide behind. This is the part of the story people skip because it doesn't look heroic. But this is where many saints are made, or broken, and Cyprian was breaking in ways nobody could easily see. Because the monastery gave him what he wanted, hiddenness. But it also gave him what he didn't expect, loneliness sharp enough to cut. There were nights when the cold seeped into the stone and into the body, nights when the distant memory of Nigeria felt like a dream, nights when he would remember laughter in warm air, the sound of a language he didn't have to translate inside his head, the smell of rain on red soil, and he would realize he had traded all of that for a life where even comfort was suspicious. That's when the enemy spoke in a voice that sounded gentle. Was it worth it? In Nigeria, the conflict had been loud, rumors, social pressure, spiritual fear. In England, the conflict was silent. Doubt, discouragement, dryness in prayer, that frightening feeling that your heart is a room where the lights have gone out. He had wanted to belong to God alone. Now he had to face the cost of that belonging, the sensation of being unseen. And here came the twist that would define his last years. In the very place where he tried to disappear, the people around him started to notice something about him that could not be ignored. Not his preaching, because monks don't preach much. Not his achievements, because the monastery doesn't celebrate achievement. They noticed his presence, a steadiness, a gentleness without softness, a discipline that didn't feel bitter, a capacity to accept obscurity without resentment. He didn't push for attention, yet attention drifted toward him anyway, like iron filings toward a magnet. Some monks began seeking him out quietly, not for advice about Nigeria, but for advice about the soul. Because there is something disarming about a man who has suffered misunderstanding in one world and then chosen humility in another. He stops caring about winning. He starts caring about truth. And while the monastery reshaped him from the inside, his body began betraying him from the outside. At first it was just fatigue, the kind you can rationalize, the kind you can pray through. Then it became persistent, an exhaustion that didn't lift after sleep, aches that clung to him like wet cloth, breaths that felt too shallow for his chest. He pushed anyway. He had always pushed. That was his strength. And also his danger. Because when you've been trained by hardship, you can confuse endurance with obedience. You can keep going even when God is asking you to stop. Illness is humiliating for a man like Cyprian Tansi. It takes away your usefulness. It turns you from a helper into someone who needs help. It forces you to receive, something many strong people secretly hate. And the rivalry became intensely personal. Cyprian versus his own body. Cyprian versus the stubborn temptation to prove holiness through suffering. Cyprian versus the fear that, if he slows down, he will become irrelevant. But there was no arguing with a body that is failing. He grew thinner. His cheeks sharpened. His eyes looked deeper in his face, as if the skin had become transparent, and the soul was closer to the surface. In the monastery corridors, you could sometimes hear his footsteps, lighter now, like a man walking with one foot already in the next world. And even then, he didn't dramatize it. He did what he always did. He kept his vows, prayer, work as he could manage it. Silence, obedience. It's easy to romanticize that. But imagine it. Imagine coughing in the dark so you don't wake your brothers. Imagine praying when you feel nothing. Imagine the cold air biting your lungs and still going to choir because the bell rang and the bell is the voice of your promise. That is where his sanctity became almost brutal in its simplicity. He wasn't trying to be impressive anymore. He was trying to be faithful. Then, in January 1964, the end moved from someday to soon. His health collapsed into something undeniable. The monastery infirmary became his world. The hiddenness he had sought became literal. A room, a bed, the sound of prayer in the distance, the smell of antiseptic instead of incense. And now the final temptation arrived, the last whisper of the enemy. You came all this way to die here? Far from home? Forgotten? Because there's a particular kind of pain in dying away from your people. The pain of not hearing your language around you. The pain of knowing your motherland will continue without you, and your body will be lowered into foreign soil. Cyprian faced that pain the way he faced everything, without negotiation. He didn't demand a miracle. He didn't rage at God. He didn't collapse into self-pity. Instead, he did something that is, in its own way, shocking. He surrendered his story, not as defeat, but as offering. On January 20th, 1964, Cyprian Michael Iwane Tansi died at the monastery, quietly, like a candle going out when the last air is gone. And in that moment it looked, if you judged with human eyes, like the world had won. A holy man gone. A life spent. A body buried far from home. But holiness has a strange habit. It doesn't end when the heart stops. Sometimes that's when it begins, because news traveled back to Nigeria the way sacred rumors travel, fast, emotional, carried by people who don't care if it sounds unbelievable. They said, he died like a monk, purely. They said, he belonged to God completely. They said, pray to him. At first it was not an official devotion. It was the raw devotion of ordinary people, the kind that grows out of memory and gratitude. Then the stories began. Not vague, nice stories, specific ones. A man burdened by guilt who remembered Cyprian's voice in confession and felt strength to change. A woman caught in fear of curses who felt courage return when she prayed for his intercession. Young men who had been drifting who suddenly felt the priesthood as a serious call, not a career. And here's the strangest twist. The man who tried to hide became a symbol no one could hide. Because Nigeria, still fighting the pull of fear, still wrestling with identity, still learning what it meant to be fully itself in a changing world, needed an image of holiness that was not imported. It needed proof that sanctity could have Nigerian skin, Nigerian history, Nigerian scars. Cyprian Tansi became that proof. And the rivalry, remember that rivalry that had haunted him, didn't die with him. It simply evolved. Now it wasn't Obioha versus the priest. Now it was the old system versus a new confidence. Fear versus faith. Manipulation versus conscience. A religion of transactions versus a relationship with God. That's why people honor him. Not because he was a perfect man in the cartoon sense, but because he refused to let fear buy him. He refused to let power corrupt him. He refused to let comfort soften him into compromise. He refused to let loneliness turn him bitter. He refused to let illness make him cling to control. And decades later, the church did what the church does when a life keeps shining even after death. It examined it. It tested it. It listened to the witnesses who had known him when he was not blessed, when he was simply Father Cyprian, walking in rain, refusing gifts, telling the truth, kneeling beside the sick. In 1998, he was beatified, recognized publicly as blessed, an event that carried enormous weight for Nigerian Catholics, not just because it was an honor, but because it was a declaration. This land produces holiness. This people are not only recipients of missionary work, they are missionaries of sanctity. From that moment, his name stopped being only a memory and became a banner. You can feel it in the way people speak of him, not as a distant statue, but as an older brother, a father. Someone who understands Nigeria's particular tensions, faith and fear, tradition and change, loyalty and conscience, because he lived them in his own body. His feast day is kept in the rhythm of prayer, and his story is told again and again, not because Nigerians need heroes, but because his life offers a map through spiritual confusion. When you're tempted to buy your way out of trouble, he reminds you that truth is not for sale. When you're tempted to blame invisible enemies for everything, he reminds you that God is closer than fear. When you're tempted to choose comfort over conscience, he reminds you that comfort can be a quiet form of slavery. When you're tempted to believe holiness is for other people, he reminds you that sanctity can grow from your own soil. And perhaps the most haunting legacy of all is the one he never asked for. He became a weapon against despair. Because if a boy born into non-Christian tradition, a boy who lost an eye, a man pressured by family and culture, a priest attacked, by rumor, a monk buried in foreign cold, if that man can become a light strong enough that an entire nation remembers him, Then, what excuse does fear have? It has none. That's why he is honored in Nigeria, not because people enjoy saints like decorations, but because his life is a confrontation, a challenge, a dare. A dare to live cleanly when corruption is normal. A dare to stay gentle when cynicism is fashionable. A dare to belong to God when every other loyalty wants to own you. And if you want a final image, one that ties the beginning to the end, hold this in your mind. A priest kneeling beside a wound that stinks. Flies buzzing. People turning away in disgust. While he stays. Because in that scene, you see what Nigeria recognized in him. Not glamour. Love that doesn't flinch.